473 on Montauk, by Sheldon Slater. There is something harrowing in hearing a grown man cry. Chills crept up the spine of inmate number 473 as he lied motionless on his side. He stared blankly at the 32-inch LCD TV, which had been graciously provided to him by his hosts. He had just turned the television off. He had seen the movie a dozen times before, and there was no point in watching with that in the background. The whimpering groans of inmate number 472 pushed its way through the padded pale yellow walls and brought the hair on inmate 473 to stand on end. Every once in a while the muffled groans turned into an aching wail so distressing, the agonizing torment could be mistaken for the screams of a mother cradling her recently deceased child. John Hardy could never become accustomed to the cries he was hearing daily. A former biology professor at Washington State University, he sat and reflected on the series of events which led to his imprisonment. John mused over the current state of the world and tracked certain events in his mind. Events when separated appeared innocent enough, but some together created the tragedy which now plagued his existence. John likened the events of his musing to that of individual threads woven together to make a grandiose tapestry. The kind of metaphor that is often used to describe God's plan. The kind of metaphor John had probably heard at a religious gathering or perhaps from a televangelist or self-help guru. He couldn't quite remember, and to be honest he never quite cared for the hocus-pocus of religion. Or even philosophy for that matter. How easy it would be to curse a God he didn't believe in. John couldn't help but wonder if this hell was a part of God's plan or something else. Perhaps it was nothing more than the wickedness of humanity that every now and then raised its ugly head in history. John became more certain. God didn't do this to him, society did. He was a man of science. He was science betrayed by man. The irony was never lost on John as he became the victim to the institution he loved. A lab rat for the genetic CRISPR experiments. The necessary evil put forth by society and deemed a just punishment for his crimes. All for the benefit of humankind and all for the sake of science. There John sat connecting the dots in his head. Unwinding the tapestry and trying to make sense out of his situation, but the situation was nonsense. The world had become without meaning. Inmate number 473 began to pray to a God he didn't believe in, something relatively new for him, as the muffled cries of inmate number 472 continued to permeate through his cell. The cries belonged to his neighbor Christopher, who had just returned from testing. John had become well acquainted with Christopher over the past several months. Christopher had been a relatively small AM radio talk show host back in the day. His show consisted of the usual conspiracy theory nonsense. Talking about secret one-world governments, alien cover-ups, and the supernatural. John would never have listened to such dribble back then, but he knew of the show. He would often describe it as blithering nonsense. Any sane and informed individual can easily find holes in these conspiracies, like water finds holes in a sieve. For the most part, Christopher's show was entertainment and most people didn't take the show seriously. Although, that's not to say there didn't exist those who took the show literally either. The occasional nut job would end up on the news for trying to break into Area 51. One individual proclaimed it was because he had heard children were being experimented on by aliens from a 10 p.m. broadcast of the Christopher Cross Show. There was a religious zealot who tried to commit suicide because she had heard a psychic proclaim the end times were starting next Tuesday. There even sparked a mass protest because the government was secretly funding chimeric super soldiers in China, as revealed by an anonymous expert insider. Unfortunately for John, retrospect on the latter might have proved at least partially true. These were some of the topics of Christopher's talk show that aired before the war and aired before the party's takeover. Aired before it was shut down by the Decency Acts and new sedition laws. Laws initially designed to protect the public, eventually became an essential censoring tool for the party. The world had decayed and life became cheap. John now found himself in a nightmare, paralleled by the darkest of topics featured on one of Christopher's shows. Welcome to the Christopher Cross Show, crisscrossing America's AM radio waves. I'm your host Christopher Cross. The crying had stopped suddenly and immediately replaced with the delirious, broken voice of Christopher. I'm Christopher Crisscross, crossed America. You on the air? The sentence fumbled into John's cell. John picked himself up and shuffled himself across the room and pushed his ear up against the wall so that he could hear Christopher better. I really wish I could, I really wish I could, but hold on, we've reached the top of the hour. We need to take a break from our sponsors. Christopher's voice was frail and frightened but also carried on like he had rehearsed the lines before. John was extremely concerned for his friend, but he himself was too weak or maybe too scared to utter any words from his mouth. He wanted to say, "Hang in there, pal, this'll pass." But instead he let out a whimpered moan and a sigh of defeat. John's imagination ran wild as he listened to the incoherent ramblings of Christopher trying to reenact a broadcast from his past. John imagined the horrors that were manifesting themselves within Christopher. He remembered the rumors that spread around the internet before his rehabilitation and involuntary selection into the science services. Accounts of half-man half-pig chimeric creatures were being created to help the organ shortages. Merpeople were being created by splicing the genetics of certain fish into human embryos, resulting in gills, webbed hands and scaled skin to list some features. There were reported sightings of mutated monkeys, whose bodies had washed up on the shores of Long Island. The running theory was that these primates had gained human-level intelligence and were killed on their organized escape. These were just a few of the rumors spreading about the horrors taking place on Montauk Island, all of which turned out to be true, and all were under the supervision of the party's chief science cha, Dr. Claywater. The invention of CRISPR had jump-started the genetics race. CRISPR allowed for the quick and easy editing of genomes, resulting in experiments that could now be conducted in days instead of months. CRISPR was heralded as a monumental achievement with limitless potential to help humanity. However, the benefits of CRISPR were quickly overshadowed as the world crumbled into chaos and the nations of the world entered into a genetics arms race. This brought the party's official stance on the matter to that of pro-science. Dr. Claywater was given carte blanche with immunity. He was given the resources and freedom from the ethical constraints surrounding genetic modification, so that he may bring the party's nation into its new glory. John had witnessed the horrors firsthand too. He recalled the day he was strapped unremorsefully into a dolly and carted out of his cell like some sort of violent insane asylum criminal. He was escorted by 2 prison guards clad sharply in black combat gear and a scientist dressed in the standard white lab coat attire. John was pushed down the long hallway, which was brightly lit by the commercial LED lighting that hung from the low ceiling. Cell chambers lined both sides of the hallway. Some were closed doors with windows while others were barred cages. He struggled to view his surroundings as his head was rigidly strapped back into the dolly. In desperate strain, he still managed to gather glimpses of the passing cells and their inhabitants with the corners of his eyes. Strange beasts, deformed and monstrous, sculpted from human slabs, wallowed despairingly in their cages. John was perhaps slightly relieved that he couldn't see them directly, but he could hear them just fine. The sounds were all too human. Pleas of help Ming and kill Ming were frequently repeated. The distraught plights mixed and mingled with the familiar cries John fell asleep to every night. The dolly and its escort made its way through 2 double doors at the end of the hallway. John couldn't quite remember the route, but several turns and a few more long hallways led him to an elevator which plunged several stories downward. Upon exiting and a few more lefts and rights, John found himself in a concrete room painted a bright white. The floor was a boring white tile with drains spaced apart every 8 feet. It was wet with what John assumed to be water and reflected the bright lights that were hanging from overhead. Multiple cameras were mounted on each of the upper corners of the room, pointed in every direction so to leave no area unsurveilled. A table in the center of the room, also white, also held several cameras along with a desktop computer. On one side of the table behind the cameras was a 2-way mirror. On the opposite end in front of the cameras were a row of dollies, each holding an individual and each as terrified as John. About a dozen or so according to John's quick estimation, as he was situated into position on the far end of the queue. John felt panic unlike anything he had ever felt in his life. John began experiencing a new sensation, as the fight-or-flight biological mechanism kicked in, but met the unrelenting restraint of his straps. He could neither fight nor flee this situation. His heart was beating through his chest, rapidly and painfully. He wanted to thrash about, turn his head, kick, anything. All he could do was wiggle his fingers attached to his bound hands clasped tightly at his sides. He looked absurd the way his fingers were frantically fidgeting. John wanted to scream, but he felt too terrified, or maybe felt stupid for thinking about it. After all, what good would screaming do to help in this situation? John thought. The urge to plead to his captors, to beg for his life, became the leading thought in John's mind. The next logical stage in John's evolution of fear, and perhaps his only hope for escape. Before John could deprive himself of his dignity, a voice echoed throughout the room from a loudspeaker. Before we begin with today's tests, I just wanted to personally thank each and every one of you for your services here today. This is groundbreaking research that could not be done without your help. The generations of tomorrow thanks you for your sacrifice. The voice was impartial in its inflection and coldly professional in its sound. John had heard that voice before from television. The unremorseful, slithering tone was unmistakable. It belonged to the chief research officer himself. The party's science czar, Dr. Clearwater. Without warning, a dozen soldiers entered into the room, each one carrying a pneumatic injector. The serum inside was clear with a sickly pale green hue. The soldiers, with swift and efficient accuracy, stopped in front of their prospective patients, injected the serum into their necks, and then left just as quickly as they had entered. The screaming began almost immediately. John remained strapped in bewildered horror as he heard the wails of his bondage-clad neighbors pierce his ears. The terrified shrieks of the test subjects chilled John to the core. John, with his head pointed forward, couldn't see those around him, but he could hear everything. He heard what he imagined bubbling flesh sounded like and the liquid splattering of human fluids on the ground. The screams became horrifically intense, as if the victims were being burned alive. John peered down towards the floor and saw a river of tan and red snaking its way past his feet and into one of the drains. John was confused because he didn't feel any pain. John had snapped back into the moment, shuddering from his memory. John had considered himself lucky that day and attributed his fate to chance. The randomly selected control in that day's experiment. He would later describe it as a placebo to Christopher, a way to compare the effects of everyone else. Christopher would describe it as divine intervention. John turned his attention back to Christopher, who had since stopped rambling and since stopped making any sounds at all. "Hey Christopher, how are you holding up in there?" John had managed to get the question out. No response. John tried a little louder, assuming Christopher didn't hear him through the padded wall. "Hey buddy, you sounded pretty bad there for a bit, you okay?" No response. Inmate number 473 wondered if that was the last time he would ever speak to inmate number 472 again.